Okay, so how were sessions 3 and 4? Amazing, great. All right, we've got a few more raffle tickets coming in. So before our closing keynote of the day, we are going to raffle off some amazing things that we have for you. Perfect. Okay, so Emily, if you could join me on stage. We are going to pick one and one and one and one and one and one, okay? So our first raffle ticket, which gets 2 tickets to Pompeii and an exploding volcano lava lamp, is Kyle Tomlinson. Woo! Kyle, come on up. And go to the back. You are going to grab the blue raffle. Okay. And our next raffle goes to, which is 2 tickets to Holiday Lights, plus a really awesome light up saber and headband lighty thingy. Jennifer Cow? Perfect. All right. Next. Oops, this one. For another 2 tickets to Pompeii with a volcano lava lamp. Dean Wang?
Dean Wang.
Dan Wang? Dean? Dan? Dean?
Should I read the number?
No, because they have both.
D-E...
We have an address, 1424. Great! Right over here, my friend. You're going to go grab a blue bag from the back. All right. And another 2 tickets to our Holiday Lights extravaganza with a lighty-uppy wand. Kalia Jin. There we go, right on over there. Thank you, thank you. Okay, last 2 tickets to Pompeii with a volcano lava lamp.
Oh, no name, just a number.
Just a number.
All right, ready? 306518.
306518. Going once. Going twice. Juliana, did you win? Oh, going once. 306518. You won? Congratulations. There you go. Okay. That way, my friend, in the back. All right, 2 more tickets to our Holiday Lights extravaganza.
Juliana Jin.
Juliana, congratulations. All right, 2 more tickets to Holiday Lights. We're going to keep it going.
Lily Gray.
Lily Gray. Oh my goodness, all the winners are like in that row. Okay, Lily Gray, and I think we have, how many more? 2 more? 2 more. 2 more.
Evelyn. I don't know what the last name is.
Ip? Up?
Ip? IP?
IP? Ip? Evelyn? Yes, yes? Okay, great. All right, 1 more from here. And last one.
Alexandria Donahue.
Yay, congratulations. It was everybody from that row. All right. Well, thank you guys so much for participating in our raffle. I'm going to go put these down, and then we're going to get things started. All right, so those of you who did not necessarily win the raffle, please know that you did win. We're all winners in this room because you're going home with more members of your tribe and connections that you've made. Now, I know, excitement, shh, here we go. Before we invite our next student speaker up on stage to introduce our final keynote, I kind of want to tell a little bit about his journey. So Shreyash, we met a few years ago, I think it was 2016, at a regional competition for our Great Communicator debate series. Shreyash came in 2nd place in your regional, made his way here to the national finals, and he actually was one of the 2 that got to debate underneath the wings of Air Force One, and he was our national runner-up. That could have been the end of Shreyash's story here with us. But last year, for our Reagan Leadership Summit, he applied to become a speaker. And so he was a main stage speaker last year at our Leadership Summit. That also could have been Shreyash's end of the journey with us. But instead, he also answered an email that we sent out a couple weeks after our Reagan Leadership Summit when we made a call for applications for our Student Advisory Council. And so a lot of the time and effort and gifts that he's given us over the past year have helped shape the details of this event. And so he'll be up on stage in a minute. And the reason why I wanted to share Shreyash's story is because in a few weeks, you're going to get an email from us. And in that email, it's going to give you, well, you'll get 2 emails. The first email will ask you, how was your experience, and a short survey. Please fill that out because we actually do take all of your feedback into shaping future events. The second email that's going to come out in a few weeks is going to be an application for you to join our advisory committee. That advisory committee has a first-hand influence on this event for next year. It is national in scope. We actually meet virtually using Zoom video conferencing. So it doesn't matter where you are in the United States, if you would like to actually shape who is up on stage next year and what this experience feels like for next year's participants, we hope that you can apply and join us. And so I would like to ask Shreyash to join us up on the stage to introduce our final keynotes of the day.
Thank you, Rebecca, for the very, very flattering introduction. Luckily, I don't have to live up to it today because all I'm doing is introducing people. But in particular, I'm introducing Annafi and Jihan. Now, they aren't people who they can typically think of as working together, particularly not in an organization that sort of revolves around politics. Annafi is a bleeding heart liberal. She was actually a staffer for the Clinton campaign. And Jihan, well, he's a staunch conservative, and he was actually part of the Romney campaign. But they've decided to come together to help solve the problem, I think, that we all recognize today, that there is a large rift in our country. In particular, using technology, they hope to combat media bias, and in particular, to help give people a more balanced view of politics from both the left and the right. So to talk about that today, about political polarization, media polarization, and how we can combat it, I would like to invite to the stage Annafi and Jihan. Round of applause, guys.
Hi, all. Thank you so much for having us. Oh, wow, this mic. Cool. I haven't seen all of your faces yet. Hi, I'm Annafi. This is Jihan. And yeah, we'll get started. So as Shreyash mentioned, we'll skip these slides. There you go. We're here to talk about polarization, media, and you.
So as you can see, this is here a chart from the Pew Research Center, and it's just showing the difference between Republicans and Democrats on their issue positions. And going back to 1994, if you look, you see a lot of purple, and purple is overlap. So that means a lot of Democrats and a lot of Republicans shared the same view on a lot of issues. And also you look at the median Democrat, the median Republican, they're pretty close. So a lot of Democrats, a lot of Republicans really were pretty much the same politically. And in 2004, it's still pretty similar. You've got a lot of overlap, you've got a lot of closeness between the medians. But then you fast forward to 2017, and what do you see? The purple is a lot smaller. There's a lot less agreement. And the medians have moved really far apart. So the median Democrat and the median Republican are somehow just very, very different in ways that they weren't a few years ago. And furthermore, they're not just different, they don't like each other. So half of Republicans and Democrats are afraid of the other party, are angry at the other party, and are frustrated at the other party. And people who are politically active, that's even more so. Over 40% of Democrats and Republicans think that the other party is a threat to the nation's well-being. So just think of that. It's not just these people are wrong, these people are a threat. And if you've been following the news at all the past few weeks, I'm sure you're aware it's been a pretty difficult time. There's been a lot of disagreement, very, very passionate disagreement on both sides.
So how did we get here? There will be many, many, many books, dissertations, et cetera, already being written. There's been an uptake in political science and all that good stuff. But today we'll just hit on one of the reasons that we think that we are where we are today. So the Pew Research Center did a survey where they asked people what they thought about 36 news sources. And what you see here is that consistent liberals and consistent conservatives live in different media worlds. So consistent liberals have an array of news sources, CNN, New York Times, NPR, MSNBC, and they generally trust the news sources. They have more trust than distrust of the 36 news sources surveyed by the Pew Research Center. Now contrast that with consistent conservatives. They have a main news source that they're clustered around, Fox News, and they actually distrust more than trust the news sources that were surveyed by the Pew Research Center. The Berkman Klein Center at Harvard University did a fascinating study in 2016 where they analyzed over 2 million articles related to the election. So they measured how often each source actually linked to other sources, and then how often each article was shared on social media. In this graph, the larger circles indicate more shares, and the colors, ranging from dark blue to dark red, indicate the level of partisanship of those doing the sharing. So as you can see, whether your friends are liberal or conservative would have had a huge impact on the news articles and the op-eds that you were exposed to. Public trust in the media is at an all-time low. Less than half of Americans, 44%, can identify a news source they believe is objective. The only media outlet trusted by people across the political spectrum is the Wall Street Journal. Kudos to them. 62% of Americans surveyed said they see partisan bias in the news media.
So what do we mean by bias when we say that the media is biased? So we're going to give you some examples. So this here is an article, 2 articles by Politico, and they're both written by the same reporter, Josh Gerstein, and they're both about pretty much the same thing. A new president comes in, he replaces most of the attorneys. But if you look at the headlines, Obama replaces US attorneys versus Trump team ousts Obama-appointed attorneys. So even though the meaning behind the articles is similar, and even though technically both are true, what you get from the headline is actually very different. Another example, use anecdotes to evoke emotion. So here we have refugees. And so on the right, you've got, let's talk about this refugee who committed sexual assault. And on the left, you have, let's talk about a refugee who went to Princeton. And obviously, most refugees neither go to Princeton nor sexual assault anyone. But by focusing on outliers, you can say, let's imply something about all these other refugees. Let's frame the discussion in a way that advances a specific narrative. Another option, use selective data. So these are 2 headlines. They're talking about the same poll, and it's a poll about Kavanaugh. And so on the left, they focus on, hey, this poll says Kavanaugh shouldn't be confirmed. And that's what the poll said, and that's the headline. But on the right, it's a bit different. So the poll also said, independents disapprove of how Democrats handled the situation. And so that's what their headline is. Both are true, but both say different things to people when they're reading the headlines. Focusing on one side of the story. So again, 2 headlines, same story. And in this instance, you had a conflict. So you've got medical conscience of practitioners versus the rights to get care of LGBTQ patients. And so rather than say, hey, there's a trade-off, you have 2 headlines, and each of them picks a side. And they say, let's either talk about medical conscience or let's talk about rights. And there's no sort of acknowledgement, hey, this is a complicated issue. And finally, sometimes they just won't report at all. So here we have one example of Farrakhan. Now, we're not trying to say that this is limited to one side. Both sides will do it. And what happens is sometimes one side will say, hey, there's no good way to report on this. Let's just not cover it. Let's cover something else. And that's a bias in itself, even though they're not saying anything by simply not saying anything about it.
Interestingly, while people distrust the media in general, they hold less negative views of the news media they use most often. So the American Press Institute did a study where they asked people the same questions, but first asking them about the news media in general versus the news media that you use most often. So if you look on the left, only 17% of people will say the news media in general is very accurate. When they're talking about the news media they use most often, that number doubles. It's now 34%. Let's take a moment and appreciate that only 34% of people think the news media is very accurate, the ones they use. So that's depressing in and of itself. But it does tell a more nuanced story about what we mean by public trust in the media versus distrust. So even though the news media in general, people are very dissatisfied with, they're still more satisfied with their own news media, which complicates the story when you realize that we're living in a very fragmented news environment. So once upon a time, we had 3 newspapers and 2 TV channels, and that's where everybody got their news. But now we have a complex media ecosystem thanks to the internet, thanks to social media. You have all kinds of commentators, bloggers, people with podcasts, YouTube videos, Facebook shows. So today, between the plethora of news outlets, social media platforms, what we can essentially do as individual citizens is curate our own realities.
So where do we go from here? That's the question, right? So we have an answer. The flip side. So that's where we come in. So the flip side is your daily digest of liberal and conservative commentary. And what we do is we're on a mission to bridge the gap between liberals and conservatives. So we offer concise summaries of political analysis from conservatives and from liberal news sources. And the idea is that we provide news for everyone. So whether you're moderate, whether you're liberal, whether you're conservative, we want to be something that you can read and say, hey, I have both sides now. Obviously, it's very hard to convince a liberal to watch Fox, to convince a conservative to watch MSNBC. So you don't have to do that. Take 5 minutes a day, read our summary, and you'll at least have a starting point. So if you want to talk to your neighbors and your friends who maybe are on the other side of the political spectrum, you'll at least have somewhere where you know where they're coming from. They're not just coming from Mars. Like you say, hey, I actually read something. I know what you read in the newspaper the other day. Let's talk about it. This is an example of what we do. So you see we have a left column and a right column, and we have different sources. And for each source, we pick out a representative paragraph, and we link to the full source. So you can read in detail, or you can read our summary.
So we're not the only solution. If you don't like the flip side, there are other ways of bursting your media bubble, right? So we just spent 10 minutes telling you the evils of social media, but you can actually use social media for good, right? You can actively go and follow lawmakers, media outlets, commentators that you disagree with. So let's say you're a conservative. You can go and like CNN, Vox, The Atlantic, The Guardian. If you're a liberal, you can go like Fox, National Review, The Weekly Standard, Daily Wire. And it's really important when you're sharing news articles to be really mindful of what you're sharing. I don't know the stats on this, but there's a very high percentage of people who will share a news article without having read it in full. And so before you share an article, before you say, oh my God, yes, this article is exactly what I think, I'm going to move on and yell something at the screen, start at the beginning. How much do I actually know about this topic, whether it be healthcare, education, immigration reform? Examine the source. So going back to that example about the refugees, when you learn about writing an op-ed, writing a news story, they always tell you to start with a hook. So you start with an anecdote, an individual story. So what's that story trying to get you to do, trying to get you to feel? Are you supposed to feel angry, sympathetic? How do you feel about the fact that they're actively trying to get you to feel this way? Examine your thought process. Did I already begin with a specific opinion? How often do you read an article where you actually learn something new? How often do you click on a headline and don't already know exactly what it's going to say? Find contrarian viewpoints. And when we say contrarian viewpoints, we don't mean the Twitter trolls, right? I don't think nuanced conversation can be had in 240 characters. But find the thoughtful commentators who are actually going to break down the arguments. And then re-examine your thought process. What is my opponent's best argument? What is my rebuttal to that argument? Now, often, the debate is framed in very binary terms, right? So everyone should have access to healthcare. And so you think your opponent thinks everyone shouldn't have access to healthcare. That's actually not the case. It's not the case that one side thinks healthcare is good and the other side thinks healthcare is bad. It's not the case that one side thinks personal freedom is good and the other side thinks personal freedom should be taken away. It's often a matter of priority. So if we're going to fund healthcare using government intervention, we have to reallocate resources and move funding from somewhere else. So that's the debate. That's where the heart of the debate is. If we're talking about personal freedom to what extent? Personal freedom at what cost? That's where the debate really begins. And you can't really have that if you stay in your echo chamber and you stay in your media bubble.
And talk to your friends and neighbors. The best way to understand how people think is to talk to them. And the people who you need to get along with, your friends and neighbors, are a great place to start. Thank you.
Definitely.
Sign up for our website and get our emails and send us any feedback you may have.
Questions, thoughts?
Alrighty. Actually, I have a few questions for you guys. So I think we can start there.
All right.
Okay. Take a seat. I guess what you guys have talked about a lot thus far is this issue on a national scale, and particularly with regards to media. I want to come at this from a slightly different angle, however. As you guys work on tackling this problem, and as you guys work together, what's your guys' day-to-day like? Right? What are you doing, and how do you deal with it?
So on a day-to-day, we cover 1 or 2 topics. So we want to make sure there's enough coverage on both sides. And given the never-ending news cycle, at 3 p.m., we think we have a topic, and then by 6 p.m., that's completely changed. And so it's a lot of debate. It's a lot of late nights. And it's really hard, right? Because we're exercising a lot of judgment in saying, OK, we think our tens of thousands of readers should read this New York Times article. So why that article? Why not the Washington Post? Or we think it should be the National Review article and not the American Conservative, right? So it's a lot of debate, a lot of explaining to Jihan how liberals will be perceiving this specific quote, and then vice versa, him explaining to me how conservatives might perceive this quote that I think is great, but may not necessarily be what the other side will be able to relate to. Mm-hmm. And so it's definitely an art and not a science. And I think the value add is really the fact that we have a politically diverse team. And so we think debate is good, disagreements are good, and that's why we have 2 sides.
Sort of building off of that question, and particularly the last point of having 2 sides, but also 2 sides to this team, right? Mm-hmm. And I imagine that considering you're discussing politics, you guys don't always get along. So sort of what are the points of greatest conflict? What are the sort of difficulties of working with someone who's on the opposite side of the aisle? And how have you guys dealt with that personally?
So it's very easy in the abstract to say, let's listen to all the viewpoints and be respectful and talk to each other, except in practice, you have emotionally charged issues, and it's not always that easy. And we've had some issues recently with the Supreme Court fight, with some of the stuff with immigration, where we have very strong feelings. And it's a lot harder when you have those feelings, because it's not just, hey, I'm going to talk about how free speech is great. It's like, hey, I really feel strongly about this, and you're telling me that I'm wrong. And you're not only telling me I'm wrong, you have this article saying how terrible I am with some inflammatory quote. And so I think it's a lot harder. I mean, I think we tend to do a good job. So like sometimes we'll get heated, and then we'll sort of take a step back and say, OK, let's relax a bit and not scream at each other, and then come back to it, and just from a sort of mutually respectful way. But it is definitely a challenge sometimes.
It also helps to know each other personally, right? So when we're attacking each other's viewpoints, we're not attacking the actual person, but rather the viewpoint. So we try to build a team rapport, even though we're remote, right? So we're working off of Google Docs, we're working on Google Hangouts, Slack channels, things like that. But it's important to celebrate the team outside of just what we do inside, right? So whether it's someone's birthday or someone got a new internship or those things, because once you know people at that personal level, it's a lot harder to be mad at them. Even if their viewpoint angers you, it becomes a different conversation.
Mm-hmm. I think you're already starting to touch on this, but given the fact that you guys disagree frequently and you have had these exchanges, you've clearly also learned from them. In that case, what are the lessons you've learned in particular that you'd like to impart to the people here today?
So I think it's important to be self-aware. There is a time and a place for echo chambers. There are times when there's breaking news and I'm depressed and I go on Netflix and I watch West Wing because I'm a liberal and that's my safe space. And that's okay. And then 3 hours later, I will call Jihan and we will have a conversation. But it's okay to take that personal time to reflect and also to use each other to say, hey, I really want to talk to this person who is a conservative and I just can't relate. Can you help me use the language to communicate? So when we talk about climate change, for example, right, liberals tend to talk in terms of social justice and refugees and the polar bear, right? All over there's the polar bear on the ice cap. But if you reframe it's true, right? If you reframe the conversation and you talk about how America should be the leader in the renewable energy sector, or you talk about the sanctity and purity of nature, that actually resonates with conservatives a lot more. So learning the language, learning the important values. There's a social psychologist, Jonathan Haidt, if you're familiar. He has what he calls the moral foundation theory. And so where he talks about the different priorities of liberals versus conservatives. And so how can I learn about your values and then relate my issue that I feel very strongly about in a way that will resonate with you? So getting to know the other person's values first, rather than just spewing the talking points that we typically use to convince each other, even though we're in echo chambers. So there's very little convincing, right? When we talk about immigration, for example, when we cover immigration, on the left we say undocumented immigrants, on the right we say illegal immigrants, because the language is different and we want to make sure that we're doing the language of each side justice.
Mm-hmm. And I think my final question, which means cue to the audience, you guys should be thinking of questions now. My final question is, given that, that insight, how do you see people applying that in their daily lives, both on a personal level to help solve polarization and also to sort of bridge the gap on the national level and to sort of make politics function more effectively? So
obviously you should read the flip side, but in addition, one thing I would recommend is taking a step back and focusing on process. So a lot of people, if you look at specific issues, you have really, really strong feelings. But if you sort of take a step back and say, let's not talk about this specific issue, but let's think about it in the aggregate. So we're a democracy. We have two parties, and both parties are going to win. That's just how the system works. And so if you're winning now, that means that in a few years you'll be losing. And if you're losing now, in a few years you'll be winning. And so if you just tell people, think about it, right now you're losing. Whatever tactics you're using, are those tactics that you want to be continued in a few years when you're winning? And vice versa. Let's say you're winning right now, and let's say you're doing these tactics, you're forcing through whatever. Is that what you want to happen to you when you're on the other side? So just sort of imagine the shoe on the other foot and do it in a way that's not talking about a highly charged issue. So just, if we're a country and we're going to come together at some point, how are we going to do that going forward? And what sort of system do we want, both when we're losing and when we're winning?
So for example, people have different viewpoints on executive orders depending on who's in power, or states' rights and what the emphasis should be on state versus federal level. That tends to change depending on who's in power and which side you're on. And so it's really important to say, okay, right now, President Trump is issuing orders. How do I feel, and how would I feel about that if it were President Obama, and vice versa?
Mm-hmm. I think with that, we're going to start opening up to questions from the audience.
Well, you were first.
Also, there's a microphone coming around that should be helpful.
Hi. Thank you both so much for talking to us. My question was about how there are definitely things that both sides agree are bad ideas, like racism or sexism. How can we distinguish a strongly held belief that we think is problematic versus a belief that is like bad in terms of its like moral characterization? Does that make sense, or should I rephrase it?
Can you rephrase it?
Yeah. So there are things like racism or sexism are really unacceptable beliefs to have because they take away the rights of other people. And I think that both sides would agree that they are very harmful ideologies. But I think one of the reasons why we see the other side as a threat today is because we're perceiving more and more things as falling into that category. How do you think we should draw that line between what is like morally unacceptable versus just an opinion that someone else holds?
That's a great question. I think it's important to dig deeper almost. So, for example, there are some social psychologists who will look at survey data and they will say, if you are opposed, they will look at people who are for and against affirmative action. And there are people who are opposed to affirmative action that they will say, they will equate being opposed to affirmative action with having racist views. And that's a very simplified way of looking at the world. It could be that you're against affirmative action because you are racist, or it could be you're against affirmative action because you don't think it goes far enough. Or it could be you're against affirmative action because you don't think it's the most efficient way of getting to the end result. Think about the people who said Obamacare was very unpopular. Some people were actually against Obamacare because they didn't think it was enough, it went far enough. And so there's a lot of simplification of the narrative that goes into the headlines. And so when you're talking about racism, what do we mean? And what do we mean when we say this person is racist? Is it that they said something incorrectly, or is there a pattern of behavior, a pattern of saying things that really shouldn't be in the common space? And what does that mean? What do consequences look like? And I think when we talk about freedom of speech, it gets confusing because we have freedom of speech and that should be protected. But that doesn't mean there shouldn't be consequences. That doesn't mean someone can't be fired from their job. Or so what do we mean by free speech, and what do we mean, especially with social media? You know, I think we see this debate happening on Facebook and Twitter where they're juggling that very question right now. And I think it's something we're going to have to deal with in the world of fake news and bots taking over the world. But I think it's a good question to start thinking more about. Unfortunately, complex, nuanced thoughts get lost in 240 characters. And so I always say to myself, be the example you want to see in the world, right? Be the change you want to see in the world. To rip some, some rather infamous person off. But I see so many of my friends putting a Facebook post on, it's a 5-page long, rant. But instead of doing that, how about we examine our own viewpoints? So clickbait exists for a reason. It exists because people click on it. So before you click on that article, ask yourself, am I going to actually learn anything new? And then don't click on it. Click on the article that's more nuanced.
If I could just jump in also, I think you make a great point that how people define racism and sexism and various other things is really different depending on your partisan lean. And so you've got some people saying X is racist and other people saying X is not racist. And that's definitely a problem. And the way I would generally approach that is, so if someone is racist, what you want to do is you want to convince them this is wrong. Like obviously, I think most of us agree racism is wrong. So people who hold these beliefs, let's convince them that they shouldn't hold these beliefs. And if you want to convince someone not to be racist, calling them racist is probably not the best idea, especially if it's a definition of racism that maybe they don't share. Now, I understand why people want to expand the definition. So they say, okay, X behavior is bad, racism is bad, we don't want this behavior to happen, so let's incorporate that. But the problem is that then you lose the ability to differentiate between racism, I hate all black people, and racism, I'm opposed to affirmative action. And I think that's harmful because you're basically lumping in actual racists with a lot of people who aren't necessarily racially biased in the same way. And that makes the actual racist seem a lot less bad. Because I don't think you're ever going to convince a majority of conservatives, for example, that affirmative action is great and that we should ostracize everyone who opposes it because they're racist. And if you try to do that, instead you're going to make them think, oh, racism doesn't mean anything because you accuse everyone of it. And then when you have someone who actually is racist and who comes out there and people say, hey, you're racist, conservatives are going to say, you say that about everyone, why should we believe you? Mm-hmm. And that's not good.
Alrighty, another question?
There's one.
I think. Yeah, I saw you sort of raise your hand first, or that works too.
Hello. I was wondering on how did you two end up working together to create the flip side when you two obviously have very polar opposite opinions, and how, yeah, you guys came to the conclusion of making this, and how you guys met and all that.
So during the Hillary campaign, I realized that media bubbles are real, and actually that even next door neighbors, so I was in New Hampshire, and so it's a very polarized place. They're very politically involved, and so next door neighbors, had opposing yard signs, and they wouldn't really talk to each other. And I thought, wow, how is this happening? And it's because inside it's MSNBC or Fox News being played. And so I realized that we needed a shared space, but also that people have limited time, so they don't want to go and read 20 op-eds. And so I decided that I would read the 20 op-eds and then vet the best 5 or 6 on each side and give you snippets. And then I found Jihan through a mutual friend because I thought I was doing the conservative side justice, and turns out I wasn't. And thankfully, I had great friends who said, you actually need to go out and find conservatives to work with you. And thankfully, Jihan said, sure, yeah, let's do this. And we've been working on it together for over a year now, 5 days a week, every day. Yeah.
Another question?
Hello, I'm very intrigued by your project. My question is more personal to you. So obviously before this, you even identified media bubbles. You were used to reading the same publications. Do you think a more rigorous examination now of both sides and the clear differentiations in everything from framing to sometimes even like interpretations of data have caused you to trust the media less because you now see almost the same tricks on both sides, or do you have a renewed faith in the media that maybe there is some shred of honesty? Just thoughts on that.
So 2 things. One, yes, I do trust the media a lot less now. I think Jihan had always been discerning, so he has helped me see all of the loopholes and tricks. But also, too, being in the media space ourselves now, we actually are gaining a new perspective. So here's the thing. Media outlets, a lot of their revenue, most media outlets are based on advertising, right? Their revenue model comes from advertisers. Guess what? If bipartisanship and nuanced conversation sold, they would be selling it. So it's an uphill battle to have complex, nuanced digests that aren't sensationalist, that aren't clickbait headlines. And that's why I always say, when people say survey over survey over survey, we'll say people want nuanced debate. People don't want to see such partisanship. But when you actually look at their behavior, they continue clicking and sharing clickbait articles, the sensationalist headlines. So how do we combat what people say they want versus what they actually do? That's a really hard thing that we are on a mission to do. We're on a mission to prove that bipartisanship can sell. It's an untested hypothesis.
Yeah, I mean, this may come as a huge surprise to you, but a lot of conservatives don't trust the media, and haven't for a while. And I think a point that maybe is worth making is that people will point to Fox and to Breitbart and to various right-wing sources and say, oh, this is terrible, these are driving it. But I think that's sort of missing it a bit, because I think conservatives have distrusted the media before Fox came about and before these other things. And it sort of filled a void in which conservatives said, we want a media that's on our side. You've got your standard media there on the other side. We want one on our side. And it's not so much that Fox turned conservatives against the media as it filled something that was maybe missing for a lot of conservatives. And this is not to say it's good or bad, but it's definitely, you're seeing 2 camps in the media, and I don't think that's great, but I'm not sure that there's a good alternative when that's what consumers on both sides in many ways want. And so hopefully we can convince people they shouldn't want that and want something else. But
We'll go with you.
So obviously you've talked a lot about confirmation bias and how the reason why media provides that is because that's what sells. And so my question is, do you think the responsibility lies more with individuals to seek out less biased news sources or just to read both sides? Or do you think the responsibility lies more with the news outlets to change the perception of the readers? And which do you think is more viable?
So I think it's obviously both. Recently, with polarization increasing so much, you have seen, for example, the New York Times, the Atlantic, hire conservative writers, and then their audience rebelled. And so then that creates a business revenue model question of, oh my God, yes, we want to stay true to our mission and actually provide viewpoints, but if our audience is rebelling against that, where do we go from there? So I actually do think there is a lot of emphasis based on what the media is doing wrong and not enough on what the individual reader is doing wrong. I think, again, right, they are going to sell what sells. We are in a capitalist society. If bipartisanship sold, if calm voices got the ratings on TV, that's what they would have, but they don't. They have screaming, they have screaming talking heads. They have sensationalist headline because that's continually what people click on. And so what I try to do is I don't rant on Facebook or Twitter. Even if I disagree with somebody, I will message them directly and have a one-on-one conversation because I think it's a lot harder to go on a rant when it's a personal one-on-one rather than just commenting on someone's comment thread. Instead of saying, you're wrong, I will say, that's an interesting viewpoint. Have you read this article? So instead of saying, you're wrong, I am right, and making it personal, saying, okay, this is what Ben Shapiro has to say, but let's hear what Ezra Klein has to say. So those are ways in which we can de-escalate and really take it upon ourselves to demand better, to show the media outlets that, yes, there is room for bipartisanship.
Also, I mean, if you imagine a hypothetical where, say, the media says, okay, we don't want to do the clickbait anymore, let's be bipartisan, and so New York Times says we're going to be even, and Fox News says we're going to be even, and they stop all of their bias. I don't think in that hypothetical people stop being biased. I think people stop reading the New York Times and they read Huffington Post and Breitbart. And I don't really think that would solve the problem, because as long as you're not going to, I don't think the media can change what people are looking for. I think people have to change that themselves. And maybe the media can play a role. I mean, I think it's useful if they say, here's an opposing viewpoint. So I think a few months back, New York Times did a thing where they published letters from Trump voters, and they actually got some pushback. But I think that type of thing is valuable, not in that they're saying we're going to get rid of all our bias, but just saying, here's something you might not see, we're going to show it to you. And I think that is valuable to the extent that they can do it.
For the record, bias in and of itself isn't a bad thing. I do care what Ben Shapiro has to say, and I do care what Ezra Klein has to say. The problem is only if I'm reading one side and not the other. So bias can be a great thing. We are equally biased, right? We are biased toward the left, and we are biased toward the right. The problem isn't so much that the media is biased, but rather they try to pretend they're not, and they just have one biased person and not somebody from the other side.
One more thing I might add is that something that we've seen recently that I actually think is not good at all is you've sort of seen a bleed between op-eds and straight news pieces. And I don't like that at all, because it's perfectly fine. You have an op-ed, it's biased, everyone realizes that, that's fine. And you have a straight news piece, you try to be objective, that's fine. But when you sort of combine the two, one, people stop trusting straight news pieces because they think they're just op-eds. And two, the news itself, if you start skewing the news itself, then you end up in this situation where we don't have shared beliefs in truth, basically. Everyone has their own news story, and they're all reporting things that are not really the same, and no one can agree, and that's not really great.
And actually, I want to interject quickly on this point, because on the topic of actually changing individual behavior, that's much more difficult than lamenting, oh, how the media is just totally wrong. And so one thing that I've found that's very useful for me, in particular when I'm trying to reduce my bias, is and I'm just going to say I'm kind of lean libertarian, right? And so I'm different from most of my friends who are either right or left. And what I'll do is when I find an article that sort of backs up what I think, I'll find one of my friends on the opposite side, and I'll in person go to them, and we'll read the article together, and we'll discuss it. because it's very easy to be very angry at like Ezra Klein. It's very hard to be angry at like my dorm mate, right? That leads to some real consequences that, you know, Ezra Klein doesn't have to wash my dishes, for example. And as a result, you know, I end up being much more tame and much more tempered in what I'm saying. Do you guys sort of have similar advice of how do individuals actually go about changing their opinions and making sure they consume media in a less biased way?
I think leading by example, right? So whether it's, I worked for the Hillary campaign, I went to CPAC. And I talked to a lot of people, and I said, hey, I worked for Hillary, and now I'm here listening, right? And so doing that hard work, but doing so in a way that encourages others. I think there's often this idea of, you guys should all do this, rather than, I just did this and it was great. So rather framing it as a thing that other people should do because it's good for you. You know, it's when you tell somebody to eat vegetables, right? Like, no one wants to be told to eat vegetables. So don't tell people you're biased and you should go out and bake out of your bubble, but rather just do it and tell them what you learned, right? So to say, instead of saying you should break out of your media bubble, you should say, hey, I read an op-ed at, you know, the Weekly Standard, at the New York Post, at the Atlantic, and I learned about XYZ. That's a much better story that might actually convince somebody. Show, don't tell. I guess it's the shorthand.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think I don't really have too much to add there, but I think that's a good point that in person is a lot more valuable because, I mean, if you have friends and you have neighbors, it's a lot harder to imagine your friends and neighbors as evil people bent on America's destruction. It's a lot easier to do that for say, some faraway politician somewhere. But if you have a neighbor who you've lived with for years or someone you went to school with and you know this person, you also know this person isn't evil. And if you can get past this other person is evil, then you get to, hey, maybe there's some reason they believe this. And if you get that, then you're already halfway through the door. If there's some reason they believe it, what is it? And suddenly you start understanding them. And you might not agree with them, but at least you get where they're coming from.
I think that's about it for time. So
We'll be around afterwards.
Yeah, I'm sure that, you know, via email you guys probably be contacted.
Yes.
If you sign up for their mailing list, you'll probably get their emails. And there's plenty of ways to sort of interact with this and interact with them in the future. But yeah, I'm glad to have both of you guys here. And I think having all of you here has been a great opportunity to sort of learn and get to know each other better and to hopefully unite the divide. All right.
Thanks so much.
All right, well, we are nearly at the end of the summit. And one of the things that we've been talking about the last couple of days is how do we unite the divide through joy, through civility. And one of the things that makes us civil is gratitude, being grateful for the things that we have and the things that we've been given and the opportunity to convene together today. So I want to start off by being grateful. First, I want to say thank you to the staff, to our staff here at the Reagan Foundation who have been working so hard the last couple of days to make sure that every single element from the boards that they were creating out of paint just a couple of days ago, to the macaroni and cheese, to the lunch sandwiches, to all the different options. They've been working so hard to make sure that you have an excellent experience. So let's give a quick thanks to the staff. I also want to make sure that we thank all of our partners and exhibitors for the opportunity fair and for the presentations that they've given the last couple of days. I don't know if any of them are still around, but if they are, thank you too. To our Student Advisory Committee, I'll ask you to stand up one more time. You have spent a lot of work and effort and thought into putting this together. Thank you so much to our Student Advisory Committee. And to all of our speakers, whether you're up here on the stage or leading a workshop, thank you. I know that with school and midterms and tests and all that stuff, you have so many demands on your time and all the time it took to prepare and be ready for today. Go ahead and stand up if you spoke or a presenter today. Thank you very much. And then last but not least, I want to thank each and every one of you who are in the audience with us today. I know sometimes I think there's different ways, you know, one of the things that helps us be grateful is the way we frame things. I heard Annafi talking about the importance of language. You might say, I gave up a Saturday to be here, or you can say, I invested a Saturday in being here and solving a problem. So thank you for investing a Saturday in addressing this. So thank you all for being here today. So, yeah, give yourselves a hand. So we are at the end of the summit. We've heard a lot about civility, a lot about storytelling, a lot about listening. So I want to end with a story. And it's a story with which I'm sure you're familiar. It's about the son of a yak farmer. I see a lot of recognition in the audience. Okay. The 11th of 13 children, most of his siblings did not make it past youth. He never learned to read or write. But in 1999, he was named one of Time's most influential people of the previous century, one of the top 100 people of the previous 100 years. Does everybody know? Raise your hand if you know who I'm talking about. No hands? Okay, I'll say his name, then you'll be obvious. Tenzing Norgay. Tenzing Norgay? Anyone? Raise your hand. So still no hands. Okay, now this, maybe we have one hand. Maybe we have one hand. Okay. So let me give you a few more details of his story and see if this is familiar to you. So in 1935, as a 20-year-old, he made his first attempt at climbing Mount Everest. Throughout the 30s, he joined a number of different expeditions and made 3 separate attempts at the summit, but never made it. The closest he got in the 30s was about 22,000 feet up, and he had to turn back because there was a major storm that would have been life-threatening. He took about a decade off, and in 1947, he came back twice with a couple of different expeditions that were led by Swiss climbers, and he set some altitude records. He got up to about 28,199 feet, which was not the summit, but it was close. But he had to turn back. Later that year, he came back, made it about 216 feet higher, 28,215 feet. But again, he didn't reach the summit. He had to turn back. In 1953, he joined up with a gentleman by the name of John Hunt, an expedition that was massive. For decades, people had been trying to climb to the top of Mount Everest, and they wanted to make sure they got there. So this expedition was 400 people, 360 porters, 20 Sherpas, 10,000 pounds of baggage. And they climbed, and they climbed, and they climbed. And several different members of the expedition got really, really close. But for one reason or another, they ran out of oxygen, the weather turned bad, they weren't able to make it. And finally, Colonel Hunt, who was leading the expedition, turned to 2 men and said, "You're next." One of them was Tenzing Norgay. The other might be a name that's a little more familiar to you, Sir Edmund Hillary. People know that name? Okay. So these 2 men took off, and they made it up to about 27,000 feet, and they pitched a tent. And they spent the night, and in the morning they woke up, and they grabbed their boots, and they were frozen so solid that they had to warm their boots for 2 hours before they could make the final attempt at the summit of Mount Everest. So they climbed, and they got to one last major obstacle. It was a 40-foot vertical rock face covered with ice. And they looked up, and they were about that far away from the summit of Everest, if you kind of look up at the ceiling of this building here. So close, but one last challenge. And I'm going to pause with the story here, because what comes next is history, and history is really, really important. So if you remember last night when I started off, I talked about the history of the divisions in our country. Rebels versus the loyalists, North versus the South, blacks versus white, freedom versus oppression. And we talked a little bit about some of the major historical names that are familiar to you: Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, Ronald Reagan. But what I didn't say, and what's really imperative that you know before you leave today, is that history isn't just a bunch of indomitably willed people who, by the sheer force of their personality and leadership, are able to make major change. Right? In each of these stories, youth played a critical role in what happened. So for example, during the Revolution, everybody heard of Paul Revere? Right? How many of you have heard of Sybil Ludington? Sybil Ludington, we've got a couple of hands. Sybil Ludington, sometimes called the female Paul Revere, a 16-year-old girl who, when the British were coming, hopped on her horse, rode 40 miles through New York and Connecticut, alerting militia at every stop. She was able to raise 400 troops who were able to turn the British back and fight them all the way back to Long Island Sound. 16 years old. During the Civil War, you've heard of Abraham Lincoln, you've heard of Ulysses S. Grant. How many of you have heard of Willie Johnston? Any Willie Johnston fans in the audience? Willie Johnston? Willie Johnston was a drummer, and he drummed in the 3rd Vermont Regiment. Drummers were imperative to communication during the Civil War, because during a Civil War battle, there was guns, there was cannons, there was shouting, there was a lot of chaos, and it was really tough to tell the troops what was going on. And so they had these drummers who would march along next to the commanders, and if they were supposed to gather at a certain place, they'd play one kind of drum beat. And if they were supposed to retreat, they'd play another one. If they were supposed to attack, some of them, that was their favorite noise. It was a long roll of the drums. That meant attack. Willie Johnston was a drummer. He was 11 years old. During one particular battle, the 3rd Vermont Regiment was completely overrun by a unit from the South. And as they were overrun, people dropped everything they had, their guns, their equipment, and ran for their lives. When they met up a couple hours later, along came 11-year-old Willie Johnston carrying his drum. He was the only drummer who had held onto his drum, and in fleeing for his life, thought that the drum was important because he knew that it communicated important messages to the troops. He was awarded the 2nd Medal of Honor ever awarded. So everybody's heard of the civil rights movement of Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks. But in 1963 in Birmingham, Alabama, one of the most powerful moments of civil resistance in the history of our country was a children's march. So over the course of a week in 1963, thousands and thousands of children were trained in the techniques of nonviolent marching. They went out to the streets and they were attacked. They had fire hoses turned on them. Hundreds and hundreds of 12, 13, 14-year-old children were thrown in jails. They were threatened by police dogs. And what happened? The world saw. News coverage made national news, it made international news, and as a result of the power of those youth, all the children were released from jail. Public pressure resulted in the desegregation of Birmingham businesses. Just as there's been a long history of divides in our country, there has been a long history of youth rising to the challenge and of using their power, the power of their voices, the power of their wills to make change, to fight for things like freedom, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. President Reagan said, "We need you, we need your youth, we need your strength, we need your idealism to help us make right that which is wrong." And your youth, your energy, all the things that you have give you power, right? Give you power to be here. You made a choice to be here today because you believe in making a difference. And what did Spider-Man say about power? Who knows Spider-Man? Spider-Man. With power comes what? With great responsibility, right? With great power comes great responsibility. We can't forget Spider-Man among the great heroes of American history. So that's my charge to you today. When you leave, don't just leave and wait for the next alert to pop up on your phone. Leave believing that you have the power to be the next alert that pops up on your phone because you are the one who's out there committed to making change. So I want to close by taking us back to Tenzing Norgay and Edmund Hillary, staring 40 feet up at the summit of Mount Everest. They're 40 feet away. All they have is ice. They have some axes. And they find a pathway up. They take their axe, a little technical climbing, and after a couple of minutes, they're at the highest summit in the world. The two of them reach the summit together. And so Tenzing, as we said, he couldn't read, he couldn't write, but he shared his story later, and this is what he said about it. About 100 feet below the top, we come to the highest bare rocks. There's almost enough level space here for 2 tents. And I wonder if man will ever camp in this place, so near the summit of the earth. I pick up 2 small stones and put them in my pocket to bring back to the world. So imagine that. This poor son of a yak farmer reaches the highest summit in the world, picks up 2 stones because he wants to bring it back to the world. So that's what you are going to do today when you leave this summit. I want you to take something back, something that you heard from one of our speakers, something that you found out about yourself, whether it's a story, whether it's a new website, a new mailing list that you want to be a part of. I want you to take 2 stones back to your world, back to your school, back to your friendship circles, back to your social media presence, and commit to making the world a better place. So for all of you, thank you so much for being here. We hope to see you back again at some future event. Thank you very much, and that ends the 2018 Summit. You want, oh.